Thank you, Rita, for those very kind introductory remarks. Thank you, Varun, for the Dharma Foundation, Civilization Foundation, for this kind invitation, and of course for putting together this event. It's somewhat daunting to stand next to Swami Vivekananda, so I'm glad he's in the background, and I hope his blessing is on this talk. I want to perhaps suggest, because we have, Rita tells me, about an hour, and as I am a dialogical kind of person, I would certainly like some discussion which Varun and Rita can facilitate. So I will keep my remarks relatively short so as to allow for at least 15 or 20 minutes of discussion, especially given the very provocative remarks of Arvind. In terms of Arvind's talk, I guess you might regard me as one branch of this vast banyan tree. As you'll see, perhaps a slightly independent and self-willed branch, because at occasional moments I take issue with Arvind, but that's, of course, to follow. Two introductory remarks that'll sort of frame this paper. I want to go back to, in a sense, at least as far as our conference here is concerned, the beginnings with Ramakrishna. We won't go back into the mists of the hoary past that Arvind spoke about, but with a determinate date, meaning the mid-19th century with Ramakrishna, and of course his most famous disciple, Vivekananda. And the reason for doing this is that, of course, the work of the Vedanta Center, and it's such a pleasure to see so many monks of the Vedanta Center here, is in a sense framed by both their geniuses, that of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And one of the things that is quite remarkable, at least to me and to many others, I imagine, is the contrast between these two religious geniuses, possessing a different kind of genius. This has been much remarked on, but for now, as an introductory remark, let me suggest that the philosophical and educational and spiritual differences between them are something that I think would provide some clarity for the presentation that I'm about to make. The second introductory remark that I will make is that if you want to come now to the present, where if one sees the reception and the interpretation that is given of Vivekananda's writings in recent times, one is a little queasy and cautious because of remarks that are taken out of context and politicized, and as a way of cautioning against that, I want to suggest that it's important for someone as multifaceted and as complex as Vivekananda to adopt a hermeneutical stance, where in a hermeneutical methodology, one tries to mediate four different contexts, which the context of the person or the text, in this case Vivekananda himself, that's number one. Number two, the historical and social context within which he operated, that's number two. Third would be our context, reading him 150 years later. And the fourth is, of course, our particular interest that we might have, whether it's spiritual or political or some combination of the two. So it's important, it seems to me, to adopt this broad method because it prevents, if successful, this kind of selective and biased reading that is all too easy. I mean, for someone as complex as Vivekananda, it's extremely easy to just take something out of context and to exaggerate its influence. I think it's far more productive and helpful to see him within this hermeneutical context, to see how one balances one statement against another, how one reads him in a more complex way. So that'll be sort of broadly the position that I will occupy. But as far as the logistics of the talk, I'm aware that it's just after lunch and that we are in laid-back LA. So I'm not going to subject you to a very long text. The argument that I'm going to make is compact and relatively short, but then I'll come up with some commentary or midrash to strike a Jewish note after the actual text. So here is the text. Bear with me. I'll try to read it slowly, and then, as I say, provide some commentary, and then look forward very much to your questions. So the electrified response at the 1893 Parliament of the World's Religions that greeted Vivekananda's opening salutation, "Sisters and Brothers of America," coming as it did amidst the rivalries and triumphalism that were amply on display up to that point in the proceedings in Chicago, is by now well known. It presaged, that is, Vivekananda's speeches at the Parliament, a tolerance and universal acceptance that he then buttressed by a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, "Whoever comes to me through whatsoever form I reach him, all men and women are struggling through paths which in the end lead to me," end of quote. And describing his own attitude, Vivekananda on another occasion asserted, "I accept all religions that were in the past and worship God with every one of them in whatever form they worship him. Not only that, but I shall keep my heart open for all that may come in the future, the Bible, the Vedas, the Quran, and all other sacred books are so many pages, and an infinite number of pages remain yet to be unfolded. I would leave my heart open for all of them." And the resonance of this particular passage with the particular twist that Arvind gave to the notion of universalism seen as a verb, I think bears marking. Both Vivekananda's personal Catholicity towards the major world religions and his broader goal of harmony and peace between them cannot be doubted. In this, he was a faithful disciple of his master Ramakrishna. There is nonetheless a crucial difference between the two. Ramakrishna's openness was based on an experiential and indeed mystical intuition of the unity of faiths, where in the transcendence of culturally mediated differences, he saw diverse religious traditions all leading up to the same mystical point. Vivekananda's ground, by contrast, for asserting the commonality of religions is more philosophical and less experiential, and is based on his equation of Vedantic philosophy with Sanatana Dharma, the eternal religion. And two quotes from Vivekananda to support this point. He says, "India alone was to be of all lands the land of toleration and spirituality. In that distant time, the sages arose and declared, Ekam Sad Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, he who exists is one, the sages call him variously. This, says Vivekananda, is one of the most remarkable sentences that was ever uttered, one of the grandest truths that was ever discovered. And for us Hindus, this truth has been the very backbone of our national existence. Our country has become the glorious land of religious toleration. And then he goes on to add in another brief quote, "The other great idea that the world wants from us today is the eternal grand idea of the spiritual oneness of the whole universe. This is the dictate of Indian philosophy. This oneness is the rationale of all ethics and all spirituality. Europe wants it today just as much as our downtrodden masses do, and this great principle is even now unconsciously forming the basis of all the latest political and social aspirations that are coming up in England, in Germany, France, and in America." One is justified, given such grand statements, perhaps in harboring some slight suspicion, as I do, about the scope of Vivekananda's much-touted tolerance. In fact, I submit his position is much better characterized as inclusivism rather than tolerance. And this for two reasons. The word tolerance has at least two different meanings. One, if you want the legal constitutional meaning of giving a person freedom of speech, tolerating his or her utterance, however much one may disagree with it, on the grounds of freedom of speech. But then there is a more robust notion of tolerance, which is that of engaging with and being radically open to dissenting or differing points of view. And in the second, more robust sense, I want to suggest that there is some slight ambiguity between suggesting that Vivekananda's position is as tolerant in this second sense as perhaps it's sometimes made out to be. Because I would say that his position is more of an inclusivist one, which, as I'll argue in a minute, harbors complexities within it that militate sometimes against tolerance in this robust sense. Inclusivism is the position in which one's particular tradition is taken to represent the final or ultimate truth, and other traditions are seen either as aspects of or stages leading up to such final truth. It does not just incorporate, but is logically committed to subordinating other traditions. As such, it is a form of self-assertion which does not sit easily with tolerance in this second robust sense, which implies a stance of equality and an acknowledgement of the truth and legitimacy of the other, even if the other differs quite radically from oneself. Inclusivism, by contrast, is tolerant only to the extent to which it can absorb and very often subordinate the other. The difference between inclusivism and tolerance is clearly exemplified in Vivekananda's attitude to Buddhism, which to a student of the history of religions is an interesting test case. Buddhism emerged out of Hinduism, from which it achieved its autonomy by way of a critique. Vivekananda's general attitude to Buddhism, spread over many of his writings, is similar to that of Dr. Johnson's opinion of a book he had reviewed, that is Dr. Johnson. He felt that the book was both good and original, but unfortunately the parts that were good were not original, and those that were original were not good. While Vivekananda praises the Buddha as the great teacher and practitioner of compassion, according to Vivekananda, it was Buddha's own followers who did not realize the import of his teachings. Whereas from a Hindu standpoint, the Buddha only makes explicit something that was always implicit in Hinduism. On the other hand, he reproaches Buddhism after the Buddha for a general degeneration of religious life, both within Buddhism and its influence on Hinduism via the corruption of Tantrism, and a truly breathtaking accusation, the creation of Brahmanism and idolatry in India, which Vivekananda somewhat surprisingly pins on the corruption of Buddhism. Part of the greatness of Hinduism, to which to Vivekananda is precisely its inclusivist power and absorptive capacity. And so he can, quite unself-consciously, say about Buddhism, quote, "In India, this gigantic child was absorbed in the long run by the mother that gave it birth, and today the very name of Buddha is almost unknown all over India." End of quote. 150 years later, when we have fully explored the logic of universalism and inclusivism, we are aware of how they can systematically neutralize difference and eliminate otherness. Such inclusivism, in fact, consistently misrepresents difference, which it either seeks to absorb as something similar or to exclude as an alien other. It is thus unable to be truly tolerant, in remembering the two senses of tolerant, a stance which requires that one sees difference not as an unstable relation pulling either in the direction of inclusion or exclusion, but as the relatedness of things bearing greater or lesser similarity in a multiplicity of respects. Inclusivism, by contrast, freezes this fluid dialectical relation between identity and difference into a simple binary opposition. The practical consequences of this are not just coercive, but for that very reason, counterproductive. Stifled by such rigid universalism, particularity and difference burst the bonds of such coercion, desperately seeking room for expression. Over and over again in this and the last century, voices and forces long dominated by inclusivist totalities rebel against their incorporation and demand their own space. The voices of women, of marginalized races and cultures, of subordinated ethnic and religious groups. There is an irony in this. Swami Vivekananda was a sincere champion of precisely such freedom, having suffered as a Hindu and British rule, but also from the more dehumanizing attitude of Christian universalism, which had its own fulfillment theology that strives to absorb all religions within itself, where Christianity in this scenario was presented as the final truth to which all other traditions led. Vivekananda well knew what it was to be absorbed in someone else's imperial dream. But perhaps his own pride and the compelling need he felt, which I'll talk about more in my commentary, to instill some of the pride in his co-religionists and awaken a Renaissance Hinduism at a time of religious nationalism. Remember, this is soon after the formation of the Indian National Congress and the beginning of the Indian national movement. This particular scenario, I suggest, caused him to turn the tables and, in a sense, have a kind of reverse fulfillment theology, a reverse colonialism on the British and on Christianity, and invert their dream. If that is so, then I would argue it was an unfortunate choice forced on him by history. His guru, Ramakrishna, was not a political person and escaped this pressure, and his essentially mystical and experiential intuition of the unity of religions was quite different from the practical Vedanta that Vivekananda, as philosopher and patriot, preached. My argument thus far has been that the goal of religious unity and understanding that Vivekananda sincerely sought was undercut by the philosophical conceptuality he provided. It is inadequate merely to replace Christian universalism by Hindu universalism, whatever the political pressures might be. We need to go beyond universalism and inclusivism to pluralism. Pluralism, I suggest, is the theoretical and practical basis for the toleration that Vivekananda preached. So pluralism, as I construe it, needs to be distinguished both from plurality and from inclusivism. Plurality as a fact merely points to the multiplicity of religions, and to the extent that it embodies an attitude, it is one of tolerance in the minimal sense of indifference. This kind of tolerance in practice trivializes religion by not taking seriously questions of truth and meaning, and furthermore, often breaks down when the stakes are high and ends up as a kind of exclusivism. The difference between pluralism and inclusivism comes at the point where they deal with difference and otherness. Where inclusivism tends to neutralize difference and reduce it to the same, pluralism, in the best case scenario, celebrates difference as part of the infinite plenitude of being, and in the worst case scenario, when differences harden into oppositions, tries its best to live practically with such oppositions. Mention of worst case scenarios is meant to highlight the point that pluralism, as we well know, is not at all an easy attitude to achieve in practice. On the one hand, it tries to go beyond the insularity of a certain kind of multiculturalism, where we all remain locked up and isolated in our respective languages, ethnicities, races, classes, and genders, with little or no communication between them. Such insularity severely reduces the human scope and potential. On the other hand, when it does attempt such communication, pluralism endeavors to permit the play of differences, seeking the unity implicit in such community and communication in and through differences. Unity in the pluralist attitude is much more a process or a relation sought than a commonality that is postulated or presupposed from the start. With this brief characterization of pluralism in general, let me indicate what religious pluralism in particular entails and how it provides an indispensable basis for a more robust tolerance. What it entails, and this is its most challenging aspect, is for religious traditions to give up their claim of the sole possession of a final or absolute truth, either in the exclusivist forms of such a claim, where other religions are judged to be wrong or evil, or in the inclusivist version, where other religions are considered to have a lesser or inferior truth than one's own. Pluralism, by contrast, recognizes the legitimacy and full truth of diverse religious traditions, which it sees as alternative spaces in which human beings seek enlightenment and fulfillment. The problem that arises is how such a relativization of absolute truth claims can be rendered compatible with the religious need to uphold such claims as the ground for sustaining commitment and community. The short answer to this difficult question is that within each tradition, a practitioner is justified in holding on to the universality of such truth claims, for it would surely be contradictory for truth not to be universal. At the same time, however, this universality has to be recognized as a legitimate feature of the truth claims of other traditions as well, so that from a global as against a local standpoint, different traditions may be seen as alternative locales within which absolute truth claims may be made. Pluralism on this account is not to be confused with an easy and unwarranted relativism. On the one hand, it takes the question of truth seriously and grants the major traditions a presumption of truth, a presumption that then has to be tested by reason and experience. On the other hand, it is not some rationalistic synthesis or even worse, syncretism, but rather remains committed existentially to a particular path, even while trying to assimilate what is true in other traditions and other paths. Such a notion of a relative absolute, if I may phrase it thus, provides a religious and theological basis for tolerance, insofar as the temptation is avoided to regard others as inferior or mistaken in general, though of course one can and must critique particular positions, including one's own. True tolerance is impossible without an acknowledgement of equality, and it is pluralism, as I have articulated, that I would argue provides such a basis for tolerance in the robust sense that I have articulated. So that's the text in a somewhat condensed form, and I'd like to make 4 or 5 commentarial remarks. The first, just to sort of spell out the thrust of the paper, is the dangers of inclusivism. which on the surface looks like a very tolerant and welcoming position, but which in reality, when it tries to sort of fit different religions within a giant scheme, ends up, in a sense, either neutralizing them or very often homogenizing them, and as I've argued in the paper, doesn't give difference and otherness its due. And to that extent, inclusivism in its own subtle way is really an intolerant rather than a tolerant position. The second point that I want to make, again, as a way of opening this to discussion, is in the title of my talk, Practical Vedanta, which is how Vivekananda chose to characterize his own position. And as I indicated in my introductory remarks, this phrase, practical Vedanta, bears some examination because in some sense it pulled away, and this is part of the genius, if you want, of Vivekananda, who, unlike Ramakrishna, who was really not very concerned with social and political reform, for theological reasons. For as a mystic, Ramakrishna felt that the world that we see in must be seen in a transcendent light, and the actual cultural and political differences on the ground, when seen in that transcendent light, were relativized. Whereas for Vivekananda, who was more concerned with politics and history, given, as I said, his particular location in the religious nationalism of India at the time and the start of the Indian national movement, it was extremely important not just to go about a program of religious reform in terms of the many sort of social challenges that presented itself in terms of sati, in terms of widow remarriage, in terms of the various challenges of caste, and so on. But it was important for him also to revive a Hinduism that he felt had been demoralized and beaten to the ground by centuries of both alien Muslim and Christian rule. And so this imperative of serving as a ground of political and cultural regeneration is a very strong theme in Vivekananda. And I'll just cite, if you want, just one, because he's such a powerful writer and speaker, just one text where he makes this point, perhaps with startling clarity, where he says, let me see if I can find the text here. He says, talking about the sort of popular Hinduism of its day, he says, today there are bells for the worship, tomorrow there will be trumpets in addition, and the following day yak tails will be waved, and people are regaled with 2,000 absurd tales, the wheel, the mace, the lotus, and conch shell. This is what is described in English as imbecility. Whether the bell should be rung on the right side or the left, whether the sandal paste mark should be placed on the forehead or some other part of the anatomy, people who spend their days and nights in such thoughts are truly wretched. And we are the wretched of the earth and are kicked around because our intelligence goes no further. 10 million rupees are spent to open and close the temple doors at Kashi and Vrindavan. Now the deity is changing his attire, now he's having his meal, or maybe he's providing pinda for all the stupid people, and all the time the living God perishes for want of food, for want of education. The Banyas of Bombay set up hospitals for the bedbugs. No matter if the human beings die for want of care. A mortal sickness is abroad in our land. The entire country is one vast lunatic asylum. And then his dramatic prescription for regenerating the country and for promoting its material and spiritual well-being, he says, throw away the bells and the rest of the rubbish into the river Ganges and worship the incarnate God in man, worship all that are born as human beings. So you'll see, in a sense, both from this quote and from the little that I've said about Ramakrishna, the great contrast from this, if you want, this transcendent perspective of Ramakrishna with the engaged and liberation perspective. And in that sense, I would say that Vivekananda can plausibly be considered as a liberation philosopher and theologian in the sense in which sort of Latin American liberation theology has made that notion comprehensible in our day. I think it's useful to regard him, unlike Ramakrishna, as being someone concerned as much not just with mukti and spiritual liberation, but very much with political and cultural liberation. Nonetheless, and this is the third point that I would make, that for the vitality of Vedanta in the modern world, both geniuses and both tropes, if you want, are required. And Vivekananda and Ramakrishna probably both recognize this, that in spite of their philosophical differences, each provided something that was vital, the sort of mystical intuition and spiritual power that was so strong in Ramakrishna, with the great organizational genius of Vivekananda trying to bring his master's spiritual message down to earth at that particular time, at that particular difficult site of history. And in some sense, Vivekananda recognized this about Ramakrishna. He said, it's important to remember in this context that something that is usually forgotten, that it took 4 years of struggle from 1881 to 1885 before Vivekananda was won over to Ramakrishna's message. And again, this should not be surprising at all, because if you consider that Vivekananda was a highly educated philosophical mind who initially scorned the simple though profound piety of Ramakrishna, despised his image worship and his very simple and direct ways in the sophisticated stance that Vivekananda initially embodied. But then when he got to be more attuned and more open to Ramakrishna's message, he said something quite interesting, this Vivekananda. He says, yes, of course, there are vast differences between me and my master, but Ramakrishna was, this is Vivekananda describing Ramakrishna, was a bhakta on the outside, but a yanin or a yani yogi on the inside. Whereas I, Vivekananda, talking about himself, might appear to be a yanin on the outside, but in the inside, I am a bhakta. So in a sense, these diverse sort of personalities, each recognizing in the other a powerful sort of complementarity, I think gives this a particular religious fascination. Many have compared the relationship of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda to that of Jesus and St. Paul, And in many ways, I think the comparison is apt, because St. Paul also, in a sense, feels the need to take the simple and profound message of Jesus into worlds beyond the world of Palestine, into the Greek and Roman worlds, just as Ramakrishna very subtly translated this, and the word translate means to take across, to different cultural contexts. Which brings me to my fourth point, that when you see Ramakrishna's sort of Vivekananda's missionary urge, then one is struck by the fact that he has to be read very carefully in context, because it depends which audience he is speaking to. In the West, Vivekananda praises Hinduism unstintingly. You would never get a sense, reading his messages about Hinduism in a Western context, that he was so critical and so vitriolic, as the passage that I just read, and there are many others that I could provide, about Hinduism at home. But of course, in the Indian context, where he felt the degradation of his fellow Hindus and fellow Indians after years and years, centuries of colonial rule, this was a different story. The same is true about his references to Buddhism. In the Western context, he presents Buddhism as part of the Hindu tradition, and he presents it in a more ecumenical light. As I've tried to indicate, within the Indian context, he is far more critical of Buddhism, which he sees as a corrupting influence, and so on. So I think it's the hermeneutical reference that I made at the beginning needs to keep this in mind, that in the true sort of missionary spirit, Vivekananda felt, again, citing St. Paul, that he had to try to be all things to all people in different contexts, and that this required great skill, rhetorical and organizational, in order to be able to convey this message in different audiences, but obviously for different purposes. I want to end with one last comment, and that is that, as I said, when one looks at the history of religions, one recognizes that both the mystical genius of Ramakrishna and the organizational and more practical genius of Vivekananda were, in fact, essential elements in presenting a Hinduism that both of them wanted, in different ways, to make a vital religious force. And again, it's important to keep in mind if you want, the two-sidedness of this message. It is quite remarkable that within a matter of 10 years, Vivekananda was able to make Hinduism on the world stage, and especially on the Western stage, an equal partner with Christianity and Judaism and the Abrahamic faiths. I mean, from that point onwards, the nature of the dialogue changes, and while condescension, of course, still continues in various forms, there's no question that in 1902, when Vivekananda died, at least in the West, Hinduism was taken, not everywhere, of course, but in many circles, as a serious conversation partner. This achievement, to have achieved this in 10 years of frenetic activity, I think is quite an extraordinary feat, just as it was in the Indian context, together with his sort of co-religionists. And remember again that at the same time as as Vivekananda was functioning, there were people like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Aurobindo Ghosh, and others trying again within a quite different context to revive and regenerate Hinduism. So I think we, on these many fronts, we have a great deal to be grateful to this man who stands here so majestically. Thanks very much.
Joseph, you mentioned Vivekananda spoke about the religions as yet unknown, that his heart was open to them. So given what you've studied about him, would you say if he were to return today, number one, would he be more gracious or kind towards Buddhism in his thinking? And number two, how do you think he would view this new movement? Those of us who are involved in the interfaith community are noticing, sometimes they're starting to call it interspiritual, but a movement towards taking elements from each of the different religions and not identifying with the parent religion, but creating a new movement. How do you think he would have felt about both Buddhism and that?
Let me start with the second question. I think, to the extent to which I can extrapolate, Vivekananda would be opposed to that particular interpretation of interspiritual, where you take elements, this is usually called syncretism, or less kindly, a mishmash. His model was quite different, that of, if you want, an organic growth. And so his idea of the interspiritual would be quite different from that, which is, I know, a very common one, but I think Vivekananda was not someone to mince words. He would have regarded that as, in many ways, not only syncretistic in the negative sense, but one which would not allow for this important category for him of spiritual growth. So his model of interspirituality, I venture to guess, would be one where someone would, as Arvind was saying, stays within his or her own tradition and then absorbs elements of truth and beauty and value from other traditions, and in that sense allows this sort of organic growth to proceed in a far more organic way. About Buddhism, it's difficult to say because this is, and obviously I think in this conference, I hope this comes up, where Buddhists now respond to this kind of absorption within Hinduism, of which, as I was suggesting, there is an element within Vivekananda. I think he would be quite fascinated by the growth of Buddhism, and I think as an open-minded person, he would be remarkably struck by the fact that this religion has really taken a path of its own. And again, I mean, you're asking a speculative question, but I suspect that being open to evidence, he would have been less inclined to absorb it within the sort of Hindu fold, and perhaps more inclined, I'm just guessing, to give it its due. Yeah. Jeff?
Jeffrey Long from Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. Thank you for a very rich and challenging presentation. I regret that I have to confine myself to only one question, but I want to be considerate to others. Your comments on the dangers of inclusivism are very well taken. At the same time, I have a question about that, which is that isn't it the case, don't you think, that if pluralism is to avoid becoming relativism or skepticism, that there's some tinge of inclusivism that is a logical necessity, that even a pluralist, for example, sees pluralism as holding somewhat of a higher moral ground and an insight into the truth that is not possessed by non-pluralistic philosophies. So aren't we all kind of inclusivist if we think that something is the case? if we think that something is true and we're persuaded of it?
I'm not sure, Jeff, that I agree with that, because, I mean, if you're suggesting that there's a tinge of inclusivism already within pluralism, let me try to rephrase the difference, all right? So the idea is, at least to make things clearer, that in a pluralist attitude, one recognizes the difference of the other as a stark difference, and then tries to see, and that's perhaps what motivates your question, and then tries to see what unities one may try to derive. And I'll give you a specific example where the differences are clear. Take Christian-Buddhist dialogue, in which I've been involved for a very long time. Clearly, at one level, there is a very stark difference, because Christianity is theistic, Buddhism, at least in some of its forms, is atheistic, all right? And so you have this very stark contrast without... Now, the pluralistic attitude says, yes, well, we recognize that a sort of central belief of the theistic position is in fact rejected by the Buddhists in this case. But why is that the case? Where does that critique come from? And again, to cut a long, at least 60-year history of Christian-Buddhist dialogue, it has led within this kind of pluralistic setting that I am suggesting to an enrichment, if you want, of both traditions. Now, I'm not sure that I would call that inclusivistic, because the openness to the other's difference has, in my construction, been precisely what has generated the attempt to find something different. So that, for example, within the Christian position, one sort of recognizes, or within any broadly theistic position, one recognizes how the Buddhist critique that theism might be projection, that it might be, ego enlargement, and so on and so forth, needs to be taken seriously, all right? And similarly, on the Buddhist side, when this dialogue proceeds, the idea is that one may need some personalistic element to make compassion more tangible and realistic. And it's interesting that in this particular example, the school of socially engaged Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh and Sulaksi Baraksha and so on, explicitly acknowledges, in a sense, that much of the sort of new thrust within sort of socially engaged Buddhism emerged from this pluralistic dialogue. So in that sense, I think there is a fairly sharp difference between pluralism, as I'm articulating it, and inclusivism.
Hi, I'm Manoj Shinde. I would just like to, you make a distinction between two types of tolerance, one of a little superior and inferior quality, maybe the inclusion category, or the, what is the other one you used? The
Pluralistic?
Pluralistic
Yeah.
category. However, just going to another meta level, the whole notion of tolerance has whether a certain problematic aspect to it. It is almost a certain patronizing attitude that I say that I don't like you, but I tolerate you. Mm-hmm. So rather than that, yes, we are distinct, we are different, and there is a certain element of a foundation of mutual respect on which a more meaningful and fruitful dialogue can occur. Mm-hmm. So this notion of mutual respect, whether a better overarching principle than just the notion of the tolerance, and how this is currently viewed in the interfaith dialogue, if you can comment. The tolerance versus, because somehow, if somebody tells me that I'm tolerating you, it feels a little, insulting almost, that any self-respecting, either a community or a religious group or an individual would feel very offended that how can that lead to any meaningful dialogue when I'm just we are tolerating each other, versus genuinely curious, inquisitive, and just wanting to really understand the different worldviews of different group of people. So just if you can comment.
Well, thank you. I mean, you've made the distinction that I was trying to draw between the two senses of tolerance perhaps clearer than I succeeded in doing, because it's precisely that difference that I was trying to articulate. The first, as I said, is a sort of legal constitutional sense where even if you disagree and merely tolerate in the sense that you are just putting up with someone, nonetheless the person has his or her sort of legal rights. I mean, you think of Voltaire's famous statement, I disagree strongly with this person, but I'll fight to the death to give him his freedom to say whatever he needs to say. That's the first sense which you are critiquing, all right? And I agree with you that in a sense, interfaith dialogue really requires more of the second, namely sense of tolerance, that it's the sense in which, however much we might disagree, as in the example that I just gave to Jeff Long about Christian-Buddhist dialogue, for example, all right, as a specific example, where the differences are quite clear, and the unity that is sought is precisely out of that respect for the other, that just because the other disagrees with me, let us say on my central religious position, nonetheless there might be profound truth coming out precisely out of that mutual respect. So thank you for that clarification, but it's in a sense very much what I'm sort of trying to aim at.